For more than 3 decades, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas has been one of the most consequential and controversial figures on the High Court. And in a new book, Republican Senator Ted Cruz is drawing on his own Supreme Court clerkship, his longtime friendship, and hours of interviews to offer a personal portrait of Thomas and the experiences that shaped his views on the Constitution. In Going Further, the incomparable Clarence Thomas, Cruz traces Thomas's journey from poverty and segregation in Georgia to the nation's highest court and makes the case for his impact on American law. Joining us now, the author of that book, Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. Senator, the book was a really fascinating read, and I was most struck by the fact that you had really rare access to this Supreme Court justice for this. He's obviously a close friend. He said he'd only do the project if it was you writing it. And so I wonder what lessons you came away with, things you didn't know before, and just inside the conversations that you had with him.
Look, Clarence Thomas, his journey, his personal journey is extraordinary. And there's no one else like him on the court or in the history of the court. I mean, he grew up, he was born into abject poverty in Georgia, born in a little town called Pinpoint, Georgia. Raised, actually, English was not his first language. He was raised speaking Geechee, which is a dialect that is common on the coastal islands in Georgia and South Carolina. He was raised with a single mom. As a young kid, he lived in a tenement where they didn't have indoor plumbing, and they had an outhouse and used a chamber pot. And he tells the story of when he was 5 years old, he was carrying the chamber pot full down the stairs, and he trips and falls and ends up at the bottom of the stairs covered in stale urine. That is not a typical background for Supreme Court justices. Most Supreme Court justices have come from pretty highfalutin backgrounds. Thomas he was raised by his grandfather. His mom was not able to raise him. And so his grandfather was the son of a freed slave. You think about the background of it. Clarence Thomas was born in 1948, just a couple of years after World War II.
Yeah.
He was born before Brown versus Board of Education was decided, so schools were segregated. He remembers Brown being decided.
Yeah.
He grew up in the Deep South, and his grandfather raised him, and he called his grandfather Daddy. And if you want to understand Clarence Thomas, you have to understand his grandfather. He was a hard man. He was disciplined. He worked. He trained Clarence Thomas. He had a fuel sales business where he would sell heating oil throughout Georgia. And he'd bring Clarence and his younger brother out early morning, 3, 4 in the morning. They'd be selling heating oil. His grandfather would not let the boys wear gloves, even on the most bitter cold day. He'd say, gloves are for the weak. And he taught him hard work. Now, the one respite that was allowed was reading. And Clarence Thomas spent time at the library, read just about every book in the library. And what I do in the book is 2 things. One, I tell his story coming from poverty. He wanted to be a priest. He went to seminary, studied to be a priest. And he left the church and decided not to be a priest because he was unhappy with how the church dealt with race and the civil rights movement. And there's a story that I tell in the book of when he was in high school and seminary. And he was one of only 2 black kids in the whole seminary. And one of the kids passed him a note that said, "I like Martin Luther King." And he turned the note over, and in the back it said, "Dead." And all the other boys laughed. Yeah. That ultimately, look, the church, both the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, were really slow to embrace the civil rights movement. And I talk about in the book how Martin Luther King, yes, he was Dr. King, but people forget he was Reverend King. He was a pastor. And the letter from a Birmingham jail, many people forget to whom it is addressed. It is addressed to the clergy of America. And it was a cry to priests and pastors speak out against the evil of racism and discrimination.
I think it's so striking, too, in reading the book, the ways that all of that informed not just the way that he thinks about these decisions he's making, but the ways he writes them simplistically so that people can understand them.
Yep.
But I want to dig into one of the concurring opinions that I think has had a big ripple effect in this current moment, his 2022 concurring opinion in Dobbs, where Thomas wrote that the justices, in his words, should reconsider all of this court's substantive due process precedents, including Griswold, Lawrence, and Obergefell, which correspond to decisions around privacy, sex, and gay marriage. And as a student of the court, should they?
Well, look, what Justice Thomas has done, and so what I do in the book is tell his story, but then also try to explain 30 years of jurisprudence. And the title, Going Further, is meant to reflect that there's no justice who is more consistently willing to say we should go further. We should go back more towards what the Constitution says. We should overrule precedent. And his point there in that Dobbs concurrence is the basis of that whole line of case law is what's called substantive due process. Yep. And what that means, so the Fifth Amendment and 14th Amendment both provide that citizens shall not have life, liberty, or property. They shall not be deprived of any of them without due process of law. That's the constitutional language. What that means is the state can't execute you. The state can't take your property. The state can't lock you up in jail without typically due process is considered notice, opportunity to be heard, without a trial, without a chance to defend yourself and say, hey, I didn't do it. I'm not guilty of the thing you're charging me with. That's the essence of the due process protection. The court, really starting in the 60s, created a different doctrine, and they called it substantive due process. And substantive due process was the basis for that whole line of cases that ultimately became Roe versus Wade and said, these are substantive protections that cannot be done by government. And to be honest, substantive due process never made any sense from the text. You know,
so you think these should be relooked at?
Well, I don't think the court's going to. When Thomas wrote that was a concurrence that was alone in Dobbs. Nobody joined him. One thing the press got wrong about Dobbs, so there were lots of headlines. Thomas calls for overruling all these cases. He didn't actually.
To revisit them.
To revisit them and to look to whether they should be justified under a different portion of the Constitution, which is the privileges or immunities clause of the 14th Amendment. So his argument was not that these should be overruled. His argument was the way these were decided is inconsistent with the text of the Constitution. And that's, I try to explain that because I think almost all of the press coverage out of that, there were lots of folks that sort of lit their hair on fire and ran around saying, oh my goodness, I can't believe Thomas said that. What I try to do in the book is explain, here's what he in fact said.
Can I go off of Dobbs? Because
Sure.
the Attorney General, Todd Blanche, recently told faith leaders on a call that he wants to make Dobbs permanent across the country, effectively rolling back places that have more lenient abortion laws. Is that not anathema to a states' rights view of that issue?
Look, as a practical matter, the consequence of Dobbs is abortion is now decided at the state's level. And that means each state, and I'm a federalist, I believe that's under the Constitution, that's where abortion should be decided.
So when the AG says that, is he wrong to start setting a federal standard?
Look, I don't know what the AG said on this, so I don't.
I can tell you, he said that it's taking longer than we want to make that the law of the land, but he's working, he says, hand in hand with federal health agencies in the White House so that Dobbs' decision becomes permanent in every single state.
So the Department of Justice doesn't have a direct role in making Dobbs permanent. I think the court has decided abortion will return to where it was the first 180 years of our nation's history. It will return to being decided by the states and the state legislatures. DOJ has a role enforcing federal law. DOJ has a role, for example, stopping federal taxpayer dollars from going to fund abortions. There are roles for DOJ. But in terms of actually enforcing the Dobbs decision, what it means practically is in blue states, we're in New York.
Yeah.
New York, there are essentially no limitations on abortion. Abortion is available unlimited. In redder states, there are more meaningful limitations. In Texas and other redder states, there are more meaningful limitations. And the difference depends upon the values of the citizens in each state. I think that's democracy. I think that's actually how our Constitution is designed. And as a Texan, I don't want to impose my values on New Yorkers. And I'd kind of like New Yorkers not to impose their values on me. I mean, that's the beauty of 50 states is that and I actually think federalism solves a lot of contested issues by allowing a diversity of views. Yeah.
The other thing you write about in the book is political violence and Supreme Court safety. I was there when the justices testified over on the House and Senate side for more funding around that. I think there is a larger simmering conversation right now on the Hill, in the states, about the tone and tenor of our politics, the violence that we have seen recently. You, of course, lost your friend Charlie Kirk. And I wonder if in this moment you have thought at all about yourself as someone who is in this public light and what you can do specifically to take the tone and tenor down.
Listen, I passionately agree with that. I wish everyone would ratchet the tone down. Both sides are guilty of it. And it didn't used to be like this. I was elected to the Senate in 2012. I mean, that was 14 years ago. It was not as angry and nasty. You and I, right before we recorded this, we were talking about baseball. And I'm a big fan of baseball. And 2017, I took my daughter, Catherine, who was then just 7 years old, and we went to Game 5 of the World Series. And the Astros won the World Series that year. And it's one of my favorite memories. She and I have gone to just about every home playoff games for the past decade. But I look back at that 2017 World Series where I went and I had no security. In 2017, it was just a daddy-daughter having fun, hanging out. Now the realities of politics is you have to have security because people are crazy. I mean, last year I had for 9 months every Saturday morning, I had pro-Hamas protesters in my front yard screaming and yelling at 7 a.m. on Saturday morning, waking my daughters up. Politics has become more toxic. And my view, Allie, look, I can't control what other people say.
Yeah.
But I can control what I say. And so I try to I'll have disagreements, but I try to keep the disagreements based on substance, to say, look, I think you're incorrect on this policy matter, rather than saying you're a son of a bitch. Like there's a difference in terms of not making it personal, not going to character. It's one of the reasons, this is the 5th book I've written. By the way, the book is right now #1 in the country on Amazon. And I would encourage, particularly for viewers who may not be right of center, who may think of Clarence Thomas as, oh, he's the devil, he's this. I would encourage, go read the book and learn about someone. He is the 2nd longest serving Supreme Court justice in American history. In 2028, he will be the longest serving Supreme Court justice in American history. And even if you think, gosh, I'm left of center, I don't like Clarence Thomas, to learn his life story, to learn what he has endured. He was a radical in college. Yes. He was a left-wing radical, big afro, camouflage pants, Malcolm X on the wall. He was in a riot in Harvard Square when he was at Holy Cross. And his journey from being a left-wing radical to a deeply principled conservative, I wrote the book because there's a shortage of heroes in the world. And I actually think people ought to, if you're looking for someone whose life is worthy of being admired and saying, particularly young people, like that's someone who has traveled a good journey. I think he could do far worse than Clarence Thomas.
You say he should be a role model for the next generation. The book was fascinating. We will come back to it, but I want to get you on some news of day because there is no shortage of headlines. On Iran, you were critical of the original Memorandum of Understanding. You said the president was getting some poor advice on the deal. Here we are. That Memorandum of Understanding is so far off the table. There is no deal in sight. What advice would you give the president at this point?
So I spoke with the president just a few days ago. My advice is hold the line. I think the president is doing the right thing by acting to ensure that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon. I think when the Ayatollah says death to America, I think he means it. I think if the Ayatollah had a nuclear weapon, the odds are unacceptably high he would use it. So what specifically should we do? What I've advised is, #1, continue the blockade, continue economic sanctions. We're imposing about $500 million a day of economic cost on Iran. It's crushing. But secondly, what I've been urging from the beginning is to arm the protesters. Listen, Donald Trump is not going to send American boots on the ground. We're not going to see, this is not Iraq. We're not going to see hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground like we did in Iraq. But the regime, this is a tyrannical regime that oppresses its own people, that has been the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism for 47 years. I think we ought to be arming the Kurds, arming the protesters.
Does he seem open to that?
So the challenge, frankly, is Turkey doesn't want that to happen. You look at the Kurds, they've been allies of ours for a long time. Erdogan is arguing against it. I have urged it for several months. At least to date, President Trump has not done so. I hope that he does, because I think that's the right. Look, at the outset of this conflict, the Ayatollah murdered somewhere between 10,000 and 40,000 protesters. We don't have a firm estimate of that. It's not fair to expect people to stand up with rocks against soldiers with machine guns. Whereas if the protesters, I think back to 30 plus years ago when Tiananmen Square happened. And I remember at the time, the NRA ran a full-page ad in 6 newspapers across the country. And the ad was a giant picture of Tiananmen Square just packed with people. And I remember the words on that ad. It said, last week, over 1 million people rose up in protest in Tiananmen Square. Imagine what would have happened if they had had guns. And I saw that ad in the paper and I was like, holy cow, that's not a protest, that's a revolution. And that point, at the end of the day, it is in America's interest not to have a theocratic regime in Iran that wants to murder us. But ultimately, it's the people of Iran that have to make that happen. So I think we should facilitate that. That's what I'm urging the president to do.
We are also watching simultaneously gas prices go up because of the ongoing war in Iran. We're watching the White House try to bring down costs in other places, specifically over the last few days around beef. Texas is home to 14% of the U.S. cattle population. I saw you say on CBS this morning that America competes well when we have a fair marketplace. Do these latest moves from the White House make it a fair marketplace? And do you agree with what the White House did?
Look, I agree with the president's efforts to open up foreign markets to U.S. exports. You look at ag, whether it's beef or all sorts of crops, or you look at cars or trucks or everything we produce. The more we open up foreign markets, the better U.S. businesses do.
So this is a good move.
We'll see how it plays out. You look, for example, at the battle with Canada right now. I mean, you've got it. It's a heated battle. In the Trump administration, there are 2 camps. One camp sees tariffs as leverage, as a way to open up foreign markets. I'm very much in that camp. There's another camp that just likes tariffs, wants high tariffs forever, sees them as a permanent feature of our economy. I think that camp is mistaken. This administration has consistently been a battle between those 2 camps. There is an amazing irony, which is Donald J. Trump could go down as the greatest free trade president the country's ever seen. Now, that does not seem naturally self-evident. But what I've seen is when Trump threatens tariffs, our trading partners come rushing to D.C. saying, let's open up our markets, we'll slash our tariffs, we'll remove non-tariff barriers.
Or they do what Mark Carney is doing and they slap on their own and they say they're under attack.
There are 2 ways to go. If we go the first way, if we take yes for an answer, that would be a massive win for the country. And so I talk to the president every week. I've been his strongest ally in the Senate for a decade. And I'm urging him, take yes for an answer, expand trade. That's good for farmers. It's good for manufacturers. It's good for jobs.
I want to talk about Texas because Fox News poll in the last few weeks showed James Tallarico up 3 within the margin of error. But when I was down for the primary, John Cornyn said to me that Ken Paxton is going to be the kiss of death for Republicans in Texas. So what do you see in this race right now? Should it even be that close?
Look, I think we're going to win in Texas, but I think it's a real race. And so my message to Republicans nationally is take it seriously, invest in it. I'm spending real time raising money to support Ken Paxton. I'm going to spend real time on the campaign trail as we get closer to Election Day. It is a serious and close race, in part because, listen, Paxton has had $200 million of attack ads run against him. That does damage. And so he's a little bit bloodied and bruised from that. Tallarico cruised through the primary.
Oh, that was a tough primary. I covered Crockett v. Tallarico. That got tough.
But Crockett had no money. So no, there were no hits. So if you look at the numbers right now, so look, you do politics for a living. You look at fav-unfav, the ratio of favorables to unfavorables. Yep. Paxton's at -15. Tallarico's at +9. Because nobody knows. Look, Tallarico, and I don't know, I've never met James Tallarico. I don't know him personally. His record, I think, is quite extreme. He is far left. He's a candidate that would be a natural Senate candidate in California. I think his record is out of step with the voters of Texas, but I think most voters don't know that. And so the campaign, I believe, when the voters learn Tallarico's record, I think Republicans are going to win, but the whole campaign is about making sure people know his record.
What do you make of your Texas Senate partner, John Cornyn, and how he's behaved since the primary?
Oh, listen, I understand human nature. I've served with John for 14 years. He's been in the Senate 24 years.
Do you guys talk?
Yeah, we're friends. We work together very closely. And Ken Paxton and I are friends. Both of them I've worked together more than a decade. I like them both. It was a bitter primary, and they're hurt feelings. That's human nature. I have won political races. I've lost political races. By the way, winning is better, unquestionably.
I would imagine.
Losing sucks. And so John's unhappy about that. That is understandable. I think at the end of the day, what matters for the people of Texas is that they have a senator who reflects their values. And you know, you look at Texans want common sense. We want low taxes, low regulations, lots of jobs. We want to secure the border. Tallarico says we should have a welcome mat on our southern border. That's not where Texans are.
Can I ask on values, though, because you've been busy this primary season. In some races, your endorsed candidates have even beaten some of Trump's own endorsed candidates. And I wonder what that tells you about where the party is as it turns the page from Trump.
Yeah. Look, my philosophy on endorsements is I support the most conservative candidate who can win. So I'm interested in both. I look at, number one, what's their record? Have they been a conservative? Have they been principled?
Do they have to be MAGA?
They have to have a path to win. And so there is no never Trump lane. Yeah. I mean, listen, in 2016 was President Trump's strongest rival. I beat him in 12 states.
What would you say to that person?
Listen, I would say that Donald Trump has been an extraordinary president. He has got, love him or hate him, you got to acknowledge this guy has a backbone that is something. He is fearless. And there are a lot of Republicans that were so tired of lily-livered Republicans who were afraid of their own shadow, that the Democrats fight tooth and nail and Republicans go hide in the corner. Trump doesn't hide in the corner. He is ferocious. I like that. I wish sometimes there was more message discipline and focus. And so for 10 years, I talk to him every week, sometimes every day. And I try to urge him to do good things and urge him not to do bad things. And he doesn't always listen to me, but he frequently listens to me. And I'm grateful because he's got courage. Look, I think going forward, we're in the midst of a debate about who our party is and what we believe. And I think economically, we've got a debate. Are we a small government, free market, conservative party? Or are we a big government, nanny state party?
Is this a party that has coalesced already behind J.D. Vance?
Oh, no. There's going to be a full discussion about who we are and what we believe. Listen.
Are you going to be part of that?
There'll be time to figure that out. I'll certainly be part of the discussion because I care deeply about economically. I think we should be a conservative party. And on foreign policy, we've got to debate, are we an isolationist party that withdraws from the world? Or do we believe in American leadership? And I care deeply about both of those issues and who the party is. And what I'll say about Trump, look, Trump is a black swan event. He is a unique historical figure. There's never been anyone like him. I don't think there'll be anyone like him going forward. And we're going to have over the next several years a conversation among Republicans. Look, the Democrat side is in the midst of a civil war where you've got a DSA takeover. You've essentially got Marxism conquering the Democrat Party. And that, I think that is a terrible development, but that's going to be an active battle as well. On the Republican side, we're going to have to decide who we are and what do we believe.
You've been so generous with your time and your staff has given me this, but can I just get one more question in to come back to the book?
Sure.
You talk about how come May of 2028, he'll be the longest serving justice. I know you say you'll be part of the conversation. Maybe you're considering a presidential run, but it's interesting that you focus on the Supreme Court in this book. Is that what you envision next for yourself?
No, it's I have zero interest in being on the Supreme Court. And I will say it's not, a lot of people are surprised with that because, you know, my career, I started as a clerk at the court. I litigated in front of the court for more than a decade. And I revere the court. I don't want to be a judge. And the reason I don't want to be a judge is a principled federal judge stays out of politics, stays out of political fights and policy fights. If I were a judge, I'd do that. I don't want to do that. I want to be right in the middle of these fights. And whether it is national security, whether it is securing the border, whether it is last year, all right, two provisions that I authored are in the big reconciliation bill. Number one, school choice. I authored the biggest school choice program in American history. Millions of kids are going to get billions of dollars of scholarships to get out of failing schools and to get a chance for education. That is a legacy that matters. And number two, the Trump accounts. I also authored that legislation where every kid in America is going to have a personal investment account and be able to accumulate assets and experience the miracle of compound growth. And we're going to create a whole new generation of capitalists. That is what I care about. And if I were on the court, I couldn't do that. I will say in the first term, this was not purely hypothetical. President Trump spoke to me seriously about all 3 vacancies. And I told him no 3 times. I don't want to be a judge. I care deeply. Justice Thomas, I think, is an American hero. And I wrote this book because I think a lot of young people don't know his story. They don't know, his experience with race. It's interesting. One of the examples he gave growing up in Georgia and then going to school in Massachusetts and in Connecticut, he described, he said, in Georgia, racists were like rattlesnakes. They were loud. You could hear them. You knew where they were. You could just avoid them. The rattle would go off and you just stay away. He said in the North, racists were like water moccasins. They were hidden. You didn't see them till suddenly they striked. Justice Thomas describes the first time he was ever called the N-word was in Boston, Massachusetts. It wasn't in the Deep South. It wasn't in Georgia. And I want to close with a story that just one I really like. So he's on the court. He's there for a number of years. And Stephen Breyer is one of his colleagues, who's a delightful man. Breyer had a vacation home in Nevis in the Caribbean island. And Breyer was mugged. So someone came by his home with a machete and mugged him. And so Justice Breyer is sitting with a couple of justices telling that story. And Thomas walks up and Breyer says, so Clarence, what would you do? And he says, Clarence, what would you do if you were sitting on the porch of your home playing bridge and a man came by with a machete to rob you? And Thomas says, well, I don't play bridge. And Breyer goes, okay, Clarence, suppose you and your wife were sitting on the porch of your house playing poker and the man with the machete came. And Thomas said, I don't play poker. And so Breyer sighs and he goes, Clarence, what would you be doing on your porch? And Thomas said, I'd be cleaning my guns. And I'd ask the guy, does he want that machete with ketchup or without? That's Clarence Thomas. He doesn't go out and seek a fight, but his grandfather who raised him, he had a lot of wisdom in life about self-reliance. And one of the things that's the theme of the book is his grandfather would say, if it don't make no damn sense, it don't make no damn sense. And that's Clarence Thomas, as someone who knows what he believes and is resolute and will stand for it.
Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, thank you. Your new book, Going Further, The Incomparable Clarence Thomas, is available now.